Evo, mi smo sačekali, vidim da se javlja još učesnica i učesnika koji će malo kasniti, ali s obzirom na to da zaista želimo da imamo dovoljno vremena na kraju dana za diskusije, za vaše komentare, za neke zajedničke dogovore, drago mi je da vam mogu poželjeti dobrodošlicu na drugi dan regionalne konferencije Pristup pravdi za žene žrtve i preživjele nasilja na Zapadnom Balkanu i Turskoj tokom COVID-19. Kolegice će podijeliti link za registraciju, pa vas molim da to nekad tokom ovog radnog dijela popunite. Pozdrav svima iz Turske, sa Zapadnog Balkana. Evo, lijepo je da se barem ovako družimo. Nadam se da ste uspjeli da se odmorite poslije jučerašnjeg dana, ali da malo zajedno svi razmislimo o osvrtu na prezentacije, na ono o čemu smo kratko imali prilike diskutovati. I da ne duljim, odmah ću pozvati kolegicu Jasminku Džumhur da nam predstavi regionalne smjernice za procjenu rizika na Zapadnom Balkanu i Turskoj, evo kao jedan svojevrstan nastavak vaše jučerašnje prezentacije, tako da imamo priliku da čujemo i taj dio i malo i razgovaramo tokom dana. Jasminka, hvala vam.
Dobro jutro svima, hvala svim kolegama i koleginicama koji su nam se pridružili jutros. Jutro smo malo diskutovali prije početka kako ovo sumorno jutro, barem u Sarajevu, djeluje veoma deprimirajuće s obzirom na sve ono što se dešava. Pa evo, nastojat ćemo kroz ovo naše druženje naredna 3 sata, barem da jedni drugi budemo podrška i da imamo ta 3 sata nekog lijepog raspoloženja, nekog optimizma i vjere da nešto možemo promijeniti. Ja sam i danas odlučila da svoju prezentaciju počnem sa 4 primjera iz regiona, znači 4 videa, i nakon toga ću se referirati na ta videa jer ipak slika i stvarni događaj su najjači instrument kada želite da dočarate stanje na terenu. Pa bi ja zamolila naše admine da nam puste ta 4 videa.
Mrs. Delay, a young woman with disabilities, was raped by her aunt's husband. He threatened to kill her if she told anyone. After he raped her a second time, Mrs. Delay's sister reported it to the police. 1 year later, he was found not guilty because a hospital report stated he had erectile dysfunction. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Delay? Because all parties involved in the investigation and prosecution process were slow to act and did not assess all the claims and evidence in detail. Because Mrs. Delay's school counselor stated that her testimony was unreliable due to her mental disability. Because of the incestuous nature of the crime, officials kept the case quiet, preventing the public from advocating on behalf of Miss Delay. Because Miss Delay was discriminated against throughout the case due to her disability, how can we prevent tragedies like this? Adhere to the standards in the Istanbul Convention and national legislation when investigating and prosecuting cases. Ensure effective and proportionate punishment for perpetrators. Establish and maintain rape crisis centers to provide short-term and longer-term services for victims of sexual violence. Establish accessible and available shelters for survivors of violence, especially women from disadvantaged groups. Require training for all professionals to prevent prejudice against women with disabilities and ensure their equal access to protection. employ specialist staff to provide services to women victims of sexual violence, taking into account the particularly traumatic nature of this crime. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain. Flora Leka and Ariane Leka from Albania married in 2010 and had 2 children. Facing economic duress, they began arguing. Mr. Leka made violent threats. After those erupted in violent actions, Mrs. Leka reported him to the police. The court issued an immediate protection order for Mrs. Leka for 12 months. Less than 1 month later, Mr. Leka killed his wife. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Leka? Because the police never received the protection order and were not there to protect her. Because the Social Services Office did not receive the order and did not follow up. Because no one notified the local coordinator against domestic violence. Institutions that should have protected Mrs. Leka failed to coordinate and communicate on her case. They failed to follow legal procedures for domestic violence. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Ensure a better coordination among institutions to protect survivors. Make it compulsory training for police officers to assess risks. Require mandatory training for judges and prosecutors on laws to protect against domestic violence. Establish emergency teams of specialists to evaluate and manage risks. Guarantee obligatory and timely outreach to survivors on case status. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain. Zorica and Petar were married for 22 years and had 4 children. After Petar became violent with his wife and children, Zorica requested a protection order and his removal from their home. Yet she never received word from the court on these measures. After Petar was charged with a misdemeanor, he spent only 50 days in jail, and then the violence and harassment continued. When he was convicted a second time, despite a criminal record and history of violence, the judge gave him only 2 months in prison, less than the legal minimum. How did this happen? How did the system fail Zorica and her children? Because the court failed to return a timely decision on the protective measures. Because the prosecution did not acknowledge Petar's criminal history and illegal possession of firearms, although reported by the victim. Because the 2-month prison sentence was below the legal minimum. Because Zorica was not made aware of her rights or services like free legal aid. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Make the rights of survivors central to all measures for all forms of violence against women. Legally distinguish between misdemeanor and criminal liabilities in domestic violence cases. Take into account the perpetrator's history of violence during sentencing and in issuing protection orders. Follow the law in managing cases of domestic violence. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain. Petra was in a relationship with Vladimir, who was often jealous. After Vladimir became violent with her, Petra immediately reported the violence to the police, who undertook a risk assessment and issued a 30-day emergency barring order. Vladimir violated the order and was sentenced to 14 days in jail. A few days after his release, Vladimir stabbed Petra to death at a football stadium. The story became a sensationalized news item. The media portrayed Petra as unfaithful and responsible for her own death. How did this happen? How did the system fail her? Because the police did not revise the risk assessment when the perpetrator left jail. Because the Center for Social Work did not react sooner when Petra reported violence, although Vladimir had a history of violent behavior towards his grandmother. Because institutions blamed the victim for her death because she chose to meet him, despite their responsibility to make her aware of the risks. Because the media sensationalized the perpetrator's claim that she had been unfaithful, blaming her for her own death. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require training for professionals to counter stereotypes and develop necessary skills to deal with domestic violence cases. Sanction professionals who mismanage cases of domestic violence. Develop individual plans for protection and support for every victim. Make it mandatory, the risk assessment at different stages of procedures, to prevent the violation of urgent protective measures. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
Hvala adminu i evo ja molim da postavi prezentaciju.
Thank you, admin. Could you please share the presentation? I would like to welcome our colleagues who joined us while we were playing the videos. I tried to refer to yesterday and to point out the fact that the so-called transitional period from the time when we didn't have the pandemic, and through different examples of work in the field, not only by women's rights centers, but all of you, we were able to establish many facts. And now we have this situation caused by the pandemic. This conference is actually a pioneer step taken by the Women's Rights Center and the UN Women, because it's very difficult to organize a comprehensive conference like this. In order to provide sufficient amount of facts, different experts must be engaged and well organized, from interpreters, the IT sector, professionals who present the facts, and this can actually be a good model for everyone else. In my presentation, the interpreter apologizes, the speaker is muted.
Ja se izvinjavam, Jasminka, zamolit ću samo da...
I apologize, Jasminka. Can you hear me now? Yes, thank you. I hope you heard me when I was talking about the pioneer steps. Yes, okay. The framework for activities of the state on the prevention of gender-based violence includes primarily the international standards and conventions ratified by the countries, but also there is a series of standards that constitute the soft law. They are not mandatory, but they are provided to the states as an instrument, and they provide guidelines for the states to establish their own mechanisms for the prevention of gender-based violence. The UN conventions, primarily CEDAW, but also UN resolutions and declarations, and general recommendations of CEDAW Committee on Gender-Based Violence are very important instruments for every member state, but also on the regional level. Recommendations of the CEDAW committee should be one of the indicators and one of the elements that are considered, not only in the development of guidelines, but also in the development of all strategic documents in a country. When it comes to regional documents related to violence, they primarily include the Istanbul Convention and the Gravio Committee mechanisms, and it's very important to consider the case law of the European Court. What is not sufficiently visible in countries in the region, and there are many papers by my colleagues dealing with victims in the region, is the directive of the EU 2012 on the establishing of minimum standards for the support and protection of victims. So countries in the region are not member states, but they aspire to become member states, and they are obligated to harmonize their legislation with the EU acquis. So maybe since we have the Istanbul Convention and many high-quality analyses about the level of implementation of obligations from the Istanbul Convention, especially when it comes to the establishment of the person of trust mechanism, maybe now is the right time to take action on the regional level in order to strengthen additionally the implementation of obligations from the Istanbul Convention and from the directive on the victims. When it comes to this directive, it is crucial from the aspect of assessment of victims' needs. This is the segment that we have seen on the video, which is lacking in all countries. It is very important to establish minimum standards on the rights, support, and protection of victims. The main goal of this directive is to focus on the victim. Obligations of the state. So when we say that we have to develop any document now, for example, if we are members of a working group assigned with a task to develop instruments to prevent violence, to investigate it, and ensure adequate sanctioning of perpetrators, and also to provide adequate reparation. Our videos unfortunately show that when it comes to these three segments, prevention, investigation, and sanctioning, maybe a certain framework has been established to some extent, although we cannot talk about a complete system, while the issue of reparation and damage compensation to victims has been entirely uncovered. So what are the obligations of the state? Primarily when it comes to regulatory obligations. This is the domain of the adoption of secondary and primary legislation. If you don't have good laws, then you violate the principles in every single case. So procedurally, if a case is not in accordance with the law, the decisions will be reversed, and there are many details related to the fulfillment of regulatory obligations. The second segment includes operational obligations and ensuring the implementation. This includes strong institutions and strong procedures. When it comes to practices of the states, let's not refer to the examples any longer because they do indicate how many weaknesses we have. Let's refer to the European Court of Human Rights. In several cases, the court pointed out in its cases, and each of these videos, if they were played before the European Court, believe me, it would be a confirmation that victims' rights are being violated. First of all, the right to life. If you remember the two videos that resulted in victims' death, and also the right of the victim to a torture-free life. So, and also we don't only talk about physical abuse, but psychological as well. The right to family life. And finally, we talk about discrimination, especially in the last case involving a person with disability, which shows us that we have multiple discrimination. Last night in TV, we saw many stories related to the 2 weeks of activism against violence. And one of the respondents in a survey said, you know, it's a bit exaggerated. We think that the reason why violence against women exists is that because women ask for more freedom. So this was a survey conducted in a capital of one country. Now we will talk about the risk factors. There are different risk factors when it comes to the individual victims of violence, and also there are relational risk factors in the relations that can be different. Family relationships within the community and in the society, and the risk factor increases the degree of violence, which has been illustrated by the pandemic. When we are facing crisis situations involving serious incidents, they affect the safety of people. So we now are experiencing the crisis. The COVID, the pandemic affects the security of people. These can also be natural disasters, floods. So various risk factors can lead to crisis situations. What is important if we have risk factors present? It's very important to make a risk assessment. Degrees of risk can be different. For example, a risk of violence against women increases women's exposure to the threat of violence. So if the risk exists, it's quite understandable that the level of vulnerability also increases. We talked about this yesterday. If you have all these factors that limit your freedoms, I think that all of us have become aware in the recent months what do freedoms actually mean. And the restriction of freedoms that we were born with actually creates an environment where the possibility of violence is increased and you are becoming more vulnerable due to your health condition. Maybe you lost your job, and this is why you are more vulnerable and maybe more exposed to the potential violence. So when it comes to individual risk assessment, in the case of victims, this is what the EU Directive 2012 is about. All stakeholders dealing with domestic violence have to be involved, including the police, social work center, and the judiciary. So when we talk about the individual risk assessment, what is the level of victims' exposure to the risk of death? What is the habitus of violence? Is the perpetrator inclined to alcohol abuse? How does he treat children? So all these elements require a high degree of multidisciplinary approach. When the risk assessment is developed, a security plan can be developed. So when it comes to general activity plan, in the case of global crisis, let's ask ourselves here, has any of our countries developed a general activity plan for this crisis? We can consider that they were unprepared. They didn't expect this crisis. Yes, we did have pandemics in the past. They did happen. And also we had floods and at a certain period of time back in 2014 and 16 in the region. And back then, we realized that our societies are not prepared at all for global crisis. And in addition to the general security plan and activity plan, individual plan should be developed as well. However, when the individual plan is developed for the victim, it has to be in accordance with the standards that we talked about, completed and complemented with the facts related to proper actions that should be taken during the crisis. It's very important to develop partnerships between experts, victims, and children during the assessment. We cannot exclude persons that this security applies to. And when it comes to other stakeholders, the police, social work centers, prosecution, and other NGOs, they should definitely be involved in the risk management process. So the risk plan is developed first, and once it's completed, somebody has to manage this plan. The advisors for victims and persons of confidence and independent services constitute very important factors in planning of security measures. When it comes to risk planning and management, for victims, there is a dominant practice by practitioners to place victims in safe houses or shelters. And in these 14 videos, we couldn't see any security planning with regards to the perpetrator. The issue of the use of police powers is focused on detection. However, when the imposed measure expires, nobody continues working with the perpetrator. It is very important to implement planned activity both with the victims and perpetrators. In a global crisis, the plan and plan management should include solutions for the problems caused by the crisis. I often say that maybe Bosnia and Herzegovina, given its structure, is the leader in the region. We have many strategic documents, action plans for different categories that do not cover the same time periods. In some cases, they overlap, and in some cases, they even contradict one another. So in such an environment, it's very difficult to take action and to be pragmatic. And if we, the practitioners, people who know the law, manage this situation with many difficulties, the question is how the victims will manage.
When we address risk assessment during the pandemic, I have to say that now 8 or 9 months from the first registered cases, there is the general lack of preparedness of the society for crisis response. We do need to address also the factors that impact this situation, because that will definitely be important for the solutions that we will provide to the current situation. We've seen states acting ad hoc, even international organizations. Global, regional, national, and local measures have been imposed for the purpose of organizing the lives of individuals. But at the same time, all those measures had an impact on the broader community, such as family and society as a whole. The crisis of the pandemic opened a range of questions that, unfortunately, we haven't seen any systemic response to or answer to. There are no clear structures visible at the levels of individual countries that these activities are fully coordinated. I want to believe that lessons learned for the crisis will serve as a good basis in the future to build such a response. All of us today face the dilemma as to how we should behave in the new circumstances. How do we organize ourselves? How do we react with the elderly people in our environment? So we have such questions as citizens. but the managing structures, the governing structures that we gave sovereignty to, have the same dilemmas as to how to act, how to organize everything, how to make decisions, and how to practically work. The police, centers for social work, healthcare centers are asking questions as to how they proceed in providing their basic services and performing their functions, and also how to mitigate the entire situation and manage the crisis situation. So what do we do? Do we impose measures that are crisis related, and how? The crisis requires quick, immediate reaction, and at the same time provides very limited space for assessment and planning. In case you did not have pre-planned activities, there is no time now to make those plans, and the institutional response in all the countries of the region. I mean, now we have a second or a third wave, depending on terminology, but we see in all of those states ad hoc actions. We have an increasing number of infected persons. We have an increasing number of difficult cases. All of this requires intensive response to intensive changes that are happening. Even those people that are subjected to certain measures do not have time to adjust to them. You know, you have one measure in the beginning of the week, you make a new structure of your life, and at the end of the week, you have new measures being imposed. Therefore, it is very difficult to adequately respond to these challenges that we are facing, especially in context of the ad hoc measures. Being aware of this situation, there are global reactions to the pandemic, specifically in the context of violence against women. I have limited time, so I will not go into details, but I will want to remind us all that, first of all, international organizations have adopted a range of declarations and guidelines with the aim to help the states and somehow map the direction for the activities and measures, and at the same time to continue meeting the international obligations that have not stopped with this crisis. And the overall idea is to prevent possible violations of human rights. Primarily, I want to mention the declaration on the implementation of the Istanbul Convention during COVID-19. According to the declaration, all the states have still their obligations according to the Istanbul Convention, but that the government must apply adequate guidelines to ensure the protection to victims and also to strengthen those measures due to the crisis and to increase the system of service provisions, especially in the context of access to justice. The declaration reiterates that all the obligations and commitment for prevention, protection, prosecution of the perpetrators are still in force, irrespective of the circumstances of the pandemic, and that all states must ensure this by adopting their respective guidelines. The CEDAW committee reacted similarly, calling on the states and the key stakeholders to respect the guidelines. The guidelines require that the protection should not be undermined, especially in context of the safe houses. The finances that are allocated to gender equality should not be reduced. We know how much our budgets are insensitive in gender-wise. They do not ensure this principle. There is a need to increase the support to civil society actors. Yesterday, we addressed the capacity issue. If we have limited human resources, then it is important to support civil society as volunteers. And of course, there is a need to include technology to have a more accessible and more inclusive approach. The High Commissioner for Human Rights issued general guidelines that refer to human rights, but one of them referred to the importance of taking measures to prevent gender-based violence. The UN Women focused also in their response on the prevention and awareness, raising support to quick assessments, access to basic services, including also hotlines for assistance and safe houses. Also in their document, there is an emphasized aspect that women are prone to violence in public spaces and that women's groups should be supported. This is something that the states should take into account when they are developing their guidelines. All of the guidelines and documents that have been issued by international organizations, and this is also in the context of meeting the obligations that the states have. The framework within which a country should be working, in fact, should entail also special emphasis on the obligations of the institution. So if we've given more obligations to centers for social work, we need to have this in mind when we're developing guidelines. Same goes for the police and all other institutions. The increased number of cases of violence during the pandemic is another factor or an indicator that clearly says that we need to increase the capacities, and we have an increased number of threats in the online world. We have an increased rate of psychological violence in general. Psychological situation or psychological state of citizens is something that definitely is a very important aspect of the pandemic. Jasminka, it seems. Is it okay that I continue? Yes, please do. It seems to me that I have the Turkish interpreter on my channel, so I hear him. The measures of the governments and institutions that relate to COVID-19 also impacted the lack of resolution of cases against violence with courts. So no care was taken of the restrictive measures being a trigger for re-traumatization of victims, especially wartime victims. The seminars that were conducted by the Center for Women's Rights Research and other activities of all the organizations in the region certainly show that there is no risk assessment during the pandemic, especially with respect to the impact of the measures on the violence, domestic violence. There were some statements, but very general. The crisis headquarters or task teams passed no guidelines as to actions to be taken in domestic violence cases. There were no even consultations with the competent authorities, the Centers for Social Work and the police or ombudsman. We've seen in our case, but also colleagues in the region, we constantly intervene, we constantly raise awareness. But as far as I know, and I will talk from the perspective of the institution of the ombudsman here, we were not actively involved in the assessment of the possible impact of those measures on human rights. The crisis task teams were mobilizing the resources of the institutions, neglecting the possible undermining of the regular mandate and services that those institutions provide. What the practitioners shared with us in the workshops is that formally the institutions did operate, but substantially they were very limited in their scope, especially when it comes to victim protection. They define that the reason, the practitioners say that the reason is that there is a lack of specialized internal structures. Some places we have institutions that are very small. We cannot ask for separate departments to be established, but in specializing the staff to deal with violence against women and to have trained staff is the key momentum in this. And we've seen this during the videos, why it's important to have mandatory training of professionals. The accommodation capacities of safe houses were not as planned. There were no big progress with respect to the measures imposed, and there was a lack of monitoring of the execution of these measures. So we don't have efficient monitoring mechanisms. And to conclude, the victims have somehow remained outside of the protection system, which is contrary to Agenda 2030 that reads and sends the message that no one should be left behind. We don't have crisis management. We don't have people trained within the institutions for this. And this really showed to be a very big lack in the region. There are sporadic positive examples that showed that the system can function in the crisis situation. However, those actions are mostly related to the sensitivity and the personal approach of responsible persons, mostly persons who have been trained by inter alia non-governmental organizations. The practice of preparing individual plans for victims has not been established, nor did the work on the relevant documentation exchange between the institutions. Also, there was a lack of multi-sectoral cooperation in this respect. So basically, the situation before the crisis, before the pandemic, showed that we have a constant problem that was further aggravated during the crisis. In some cases, in the institutions, there are risk assessment forms. And I think there were examples from the Republic of Serbia, the police, and the prosecutor's office. But not all institutions have the same forms. So there is no system, and this reflects on the efficiency and the urgency in protection provision. It is important to have a uniform risk assessment forms in cases of violence, and the precondition for this is the legal framework, rule book, a legal act, or another form of regulation that stipulates these forms. I think that with this, I've ended my presentation. So what I try to present is the framework, and thinking about the videos, the workshops, the obligations of the states. We've used all that to develop the guidelines that will be presented by Meliha Sendic. I would like to thank you for your attention. Yasminka Jumhur, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and clear presentation. You've already announced that we will now hear from Meliha Sendic. She's the president of the Center for Women's Rights. She will, in fact, talk about risk assessment in this entire process and how risk assessment can contribute to reducing violence and prevention of further escalation of violence against women. Meliha, please take the floor. I'm here. I hope you can hear me. So once again, good morning to everyone. For those of you who were not present yesterday, there are some new people today. Yesterday, I just gave a brief overview of our work, but allow me to thank you all for connecting today. We have really a large number of participants, and without you, this conference would not have a point. We worked together for 2 years, and I can also speak from the role and perspective of a trainer, because together with you during 2020, I've been in seminars and workshops where we exchanged our views and experiences with respect to problems that we are facing. We've had over 90 participants from the institutions involved in the protection system and from all the countries present here today. We've together come to conclusions, and those seminars served as a channel for data collection on in this field of protection of women from violence. We've collected information about the relevant legislation, but also about the priorities and the various limitations that the institutions faced during the pandemic. I'd particularly like to underline that Janana Radončić and Yasminka Jumhur, they addressed this yesterday and today. There have been various research, not only by our organization, they have by other organizations and international organizations. So I don't know why it was a surprise that the system is not functioning, a surprise that the system is not interconnected and it's not coordinated. For NGOs, especially for our NGO that also performed the monitoring of the judiciary, we've known this, through in working with our clients and in working with the system. We are aware that the system is not functioning, and we are aware of the parts of the system that are functioning. All the problems now became more visible during the pandemic, but it's nothing new. So for all these reasons, during the seminars, we agreed that there is a necessity to produce a document that will be useful for everyone as a basis, as a foundation to start solving the problems, not only the problems of the crisis, but the problems that we've had also before the crisis. I'd like to ask the admin now to share my presentation. Adam, I believe in you. I know you're tired, but please, could you share my presentation? There it is. Thank you. I already provided an introduction. Yasminka told you what the purpose of my presentation will be. And now I come back to the fact that we've had over 90 participants in the seminars, and they all had the same view that the established legal and political framework is not a guarantee that the victims will be protected. And the pandemic, in fact, was then an indicator that showed that, so there is no need to debate on this anymore. And we've agreed to develop a document entitled Regional Guidelines for Risk Assessment and Risk Management to prevent the escalation and repetition of violence. The aim of this document is to help the national stakeholders in predicting potential impact of the crisis on violence against women, to inform on risk and vulnerabilities of all the subjects in the protection system chain that are still present in this period. Nothing much has changed in the field compared to the previous period. Organizations working directly of the clients know that. The guidelines can also offer help to the subjects at the national level to work on the strengthening of the internal capacities, and also what we've confirmed in the roundtables and the study that was presented by Janana yesterday, and that was confirmed in all our work. We can work together, and there are many good practice examples with respect to responses and reactions of one state in certain aspects, where they really managed to help women in the best possible way in their situation. Therefore, these guidelines really can serve to promote the strengthening of our cross-border cooperation.
As I've already said, colleague Yasminka talked about this a lot, about the framework, so I will not go into details talking about overall legislative framework. We have heard about this already in a perfect way. Let me just say that the purpose of the guidelines and what has to be done is as follows. On the regulatory level, the Balkans countries and Turkey must harmonize their legislative framework with international standards. All the conventions, directives, and everything that was relevant was already mentioned by Yasminka in her presentation, so I will move on to the next steps. relevant authorities are obligated to consult these instruments in order to work on, when they work on the prevention of violence against women and its escalation. All these solutions are included in these instruments and integrated in the regional guidelines that are on the operational level. They are targeted at bodies that work on cases of violence against women, and they are also focused on activities during the crisis situations. The guidelines and this document will be sent to every country in your languages, and I will briefly tell you about the concept of the guidelines. They include two parts. One is related to the regulatory part, and the second one to the operational part. Regardless of the crisis caused by the pandemic, countries should, and we agreed on this at the seminar. In early April, I gave numerous interviews when I said that a pandemic or any crisis should not be an excuse for a failure of the protection system to function. Intensity and modalities of the implementation should be adapted to extraordinary circumstances, and there is no excuse for the delay in activities of the state. Ensure the establishment of high-quality cooperation between the institutions and civil society organizations, including specialized associations working directly with victims of crimes. In all countries, more efforts should be put in further harmonization of national legislation with the Istanbul Convention in order to incriminate all forms of violence against women. Janana was talking about this yesterday, and also Jasminka tackled this topic, so there is no need for me to go into details in that regard. In the context of the provisions of the EU Directive on Victims and in accordance with the Istanbul Convention, national legislations should introduce the so-called persons of confidence in order to overcome limited capacities of the institutions, especially during the crisis. In different seminars that we attended, we discussed a lot about how a person of confidence or person of trust can contribute to the reduction of the rate of violence against women. And the majority of countries agreed with this, and they asked that we should share some examples of good practices with the other countries that don't have the person of confidence. Montenegro does, and I hope that next year Bosnia and Herzegovina will also be a good example, because in the next 10 days or so, we expect an amendment to the law on the protection from violence to be introduced. An article should be introduced prescribing and defining the person of confidence. It was done at our initiative, and hopefully we will be able to share this good practice with other interested countries. Since the beginning of April and until 2 months ago or 2.5 months ago, we had more than 600 women clients, and we worked under the conditions that were not adapted to the requirements of our work. We tried to adapt. However, with all these restrictions, it was very difficult, especially during the curfew, to provide adequate protection. It was practically impossible, but our organization was actually the person of confidence, and in cooperation with the institutions in the protection chain, we somehow managed to prevent the escalation of violence into the cases of death, which could have happened in several cases. I think that a person of confidence, in addition to helping women to overcome this process more easily, they also help the institutions to use their capacities and time more efficiently. The moderator, Emina, and facilitator, please feel free to warn me if I need to speak more slowly, or I don't mind. Feel free to interrupt me, because when I start talking, I can go into really great details because I have a lot to say. And all of these things that I'm talking about are based on practice and based on discussions I had with the institutions. And I know exactly what representatives of different states said, and they all of them asked us to find the best way to overcome this situation. What is obligatory is that when adopting the measures, the crisis headquarters should involve institutions and specialized women's organizations in civil society in the assessment of crisis impact on violence against women. In order to provide integrated response and coordinated cooperation, existing protocols and other operational documents on the local level should be amended. Increase effective cooperation, coordination, and intersectoral dialogue between the institutions in the protection chain for women, the protection of women against violence, with a clear concept of the support model to encourage local activities bottom up, attributing equal importance to every local group and individual actions.
Na operativnom nivou,
on the operational level, I think it's clear to everyone. They already know this from the experience. We are now talking about the implementation. So regardless of the pandemic crisis, the countries must apply the main risk principles through 3 phases. Maybe this is a novelty that the majority of institutions should introduce, because all security management rules and crisis management rules must follow the basic risk principles through the 3 phases that include preparation, risk assessment, and implementation. In the preparation stage, we can all have good intentions and good proposals. The interpreter apologizes, the sound is very poor. So activities and the vision can be well planned, but the next thing that should be done in the preparation stage is to develop the action plan for the risk assessment implementation. And all of this should be done by the appointed working group. Risk assessment procedures should be prioritized, and decisions on measures should be taken, and also the assessment should be documented, because if it is documented, it can be revised, and only in that way a system for the monitoring of the implementation of risk assessment plan can be developed. Crises are inevitable, but in the modern world, with the private sector and public institutions, they have to change their method of operation. And also the reaction of the crisis management within the institutions should be planned for, because if plans are good, crises can be shorter and they can have lesser consequences. I talk about all kinds of crises. When we develop a plan, it will enable the fulfillment of women's needs adapted to their individual requirements. The next one is established coordination mechanism between institutional mechanisms for the prevention of violence against women and crisis headquarters. This is something that should be done definitely as soon as possible. For me personally, it's hard to understand when somebody says that this is not feasible, because this very conference shows us that it is possible to organize. They can also organize meetings using all modern IT technologies. They can adapt to the current circumstances at least once a month. During the development of crisis plans, all institutions must consider the high risk factor related to violence, and accordingly they should plan for measures to reduce the impact of stress, which can include psychological and legal support and pedagogical counseling. During the seminars that we attended, we discussed the situational violence, which has expanded during the pandemic. And this is when we somehow broke the prejudice and bias, because the violence doesn't only happen in dysfunctional communities. The violence also occurred in environments where it never existed before. And also the support of mental health centers and psychologists was lacking, because some people don't need legal aid. They just need to put up with the situation during the isolation with abuser in order to prevent lethal outcome. And this, together with all other recommendations, is very, very important. How much time do I have? Okay. In order to take efficient and prompt action to provide protection of victims in emergency situations, internal structures, departments, or appointed certified experts should be established depending on the size and capacity of human resources of the institutions, with the broadest possible powers. We discussed these issues during the seminars also, and all the states agreed. This was one of the main recommendations, along with the trainings that are organized for all countries that have participated in the seminar. In every institution, establish duties on call for urgent cases, because in case one institution is unable to react, there must be modalities for ad hoc solutions. This includes and implies an especially high level of communication between the institutions. Citizens must be informed about the procedure in an adequate way and understandable for them. Lists with contact data of experts who work on the protection of women against violence should be developed in case of the need for urgent action. This is also one of the recommendations from regional seminars. It is necessary to advocate for the development and mandatory application of uniform risk assessment forms in cases of domestic violence and intimate partner violence in all relevant institutions in the protection system, in order to foresee further protection steps and prevent the repetition of violence and escalation of violence. And in order to make things clearer, a practical guide for its implementation should be developed. The risk assessment forms already exist in some institutions of the countries in the region, mostly in the police and prosecutors' offices. However, the fact is that all institutions do not have these forms, which makes their work difficult in terms of providing efficient protection in urgent cases. It is necessary to introduce the development of security plan for women, victims and survivors of violence, and women exposed to increased risk of violence. A well-developed security plan is the basis for safer exit from a violent situation with minimum consequences and prevention of violence escalation. The security plan should be developed together by relevant authorities, police, social work centers, prosecutors' offices, in cooperation with CSOs dealing with victims' protection. During the development of the plan and implementation of measures, special attention should be paid to the protection of women from marginalized groups, persons with disabilities, members of ethnic and social minorities, women migrants in this situation, and so on. Considering the shortfalls in treatment of violence victims during the pandemic, all relevant authorities are called and invited to consider the possibility of providing support to violence victims in all procedures related to violence by including experts from CSOs dealing with protection. In the long term, such a solution should be incorporated in legislation as obligatory, and also the person of confidence mechanism should be established in accordance with the obligation from the Istanbul Convention and in view of the framework established by the Directive on Victims from 2012.
Ovo je također glavna preporuka.
This is also the main recommendation which was present in previous studies and surveys and in our seminars. It is the following for all institutions in the protection system: the judiciary, law enforcement agencies, social work centers, healthcare institutions. Mandatory trainings should be introduced, focusing on sensibilization in order to prevent the influence of bias and stereotypes on decision-making and approach of professionals to violence survivors. I can now mention good experiences from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We exchanged these models in the seminars, and it's proved that such trainings can be included in the regular judicial and prosecutorial training plans in other countries, because our organization has been organizing seminars on this principle for 3 years, so it is possible. Competent authorities should take more efficient measures to monitor the implementation of protection measures, which requires amendments to the protocols and other acts and establishment of a more efficient mechanism for urgent action in case of violations of the imposed measures. Thank you for your attention. Thank you all very much for listening to me in this great number. And also, although you had the chance to listen to me and see me during this year in various seminars, and this will likely continue. This document that we have developed was created based on the joint initiative and willingness of all to change the current situation in order to be able to work more easily in a safer way and prevent violence escalation. Thank you all once again. Meliha, thank you very much for this presentation. And thank you for very clear, concrete, and applicable recommendations that are compatible with the institutional structure in every participant country. I know that the participants will now be desperate because of the 10-minute break that I'm announcing now. But let's use this break to make some calls that we need, think about comments and questions, and let's come back at 11:30. Please don't log out, just mute yourselves and switch off the camera. And is that okay? Yes. Ivana, have a nice day. Thank you for the participation. I saw that you liked this part about the person of confidence. See you later.
Lagano se vraćamo, ali dok vidim da je još
We are
panika.
slowly coming back. Some cameras are on, and I believe people will be coming back.
Kažem 15 odmah, tu će biti 20 minuta ili pola sata.
Well, whatever you say, it's 15 minutes, it will be 20 minutes. I said 10, so it will be 15 most probably, but slowly people are coming back and we are starting.
Evo, polako se vraćamo i pretpostavljam da ste vi svi...
Okay, I believe that most of you are either back or are close to your screens. Maybe your cameras are off.
Diskusija...
The idea for the rest of this meeting is the discussion and adoption of the regional document for risk assessment and risk management. This is a document that is a product of your joint work and the regional seminars that you've had. So I don't think this will be a formal adoption, but definitely discussion is welcome with respect to your reflections on the guidelines or your reflections on your participation in the process, as well as your views as to the most important aspects related to institutional strengthening in the respective countries. And of course, any contribution to you is more than welcome. I am taking the floor. Maya is here. Hello, everyone. I wanted to, first of all, greet the organizers of the regional conference as well as all the participants. Yes, my name is Maya Živovic. I work in the higher court for misdemeanors in Montenegro. I will not be long, but I wanted to say that from the start of the pandemic, that's mid-March, possibly start of April, I became aware that NGOs have recorded an increased number of reported cases of domestic violence, 20 to 30% more than in the previous year, according to their assessment. The reason must be that the perpetrators of violence use violence, intimidation, isolation, and isolation has been imposed to everyone to take the rights of the victims to physical safety, dignity, and respect, and to take over the power from the victim to impose control over the victim. I'm also aware that our NGOs and centers for women's rights, so all organizations that deal with domestic violence, provide free legal aid and have their legal service where they employ lawyers and have been actively involved. And how is that? Because they provide support to the victim of violence. They monitor the entire process and they also appear in court proceedings as person of trust, as you've mentioned during the conference today. I just want to apologize for not being able to join you yesterday. I had some other obligations, but it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Another thing that I could say is that by the adoption of our law on the protection from domestic violence in 2011, we have used this law to make the strategy to combat domestic violence and the mandatory protocol on the actions, prevention, and protection from domestic violence. This protocol defines the procedures and the institutional cooperation related to domestic violence and violence against women, and regulates a joint effort of all the systems during the implementation of the law on the protection from domestic violence and the Istanbul Convention. I'd like to say that this protocol, once it was adopted, was signed by the Ministry of Justice, the Supreme Court, the Supreme Prosecutor's Office, Ministry of Education, Sports and Ministry of Health, Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, the Police Administration, and the Minor Offense Council of Montenegro. This protocol serves as a basis for the actions of the protection subjects and for prevention of domestic violence. This protocol also determines the competences of the police, the prosecutor's office, the courts, the social work centers, the educational institutions, healthcare institutions. I don't know if I've skipped some of the institutions that are envisaged by the protocol, but more or less that's the system. And the protocol also stipulates certain templates, uniform templates. And I'm saying this because during last year, at the level of Montenegro, we've had a range of seminars relating to this topic. It was 3 or 4 seminars, and I was one of the trainers for the judiciary when we had that target group as participants. And the participants of the seminar were introduced to the forms. So there are special forms for the police administration, for the Center for Social Work, for the healthcare institution, for education. And they are user-friendly. So any official or officer working on this cannot make their own decisions because there is a form that clearly indicates steps, and none of these steps can be excluded. In the police, we have a form that reads that the police officer must go to the scene, and there always must be a man and a woman, 2 police officers. Also, when the offender is being deprived of his liberty, there must be a report, and also they must always check whether there is any weapon. So it's a search of the dwelling. In fact, they have to contact the prosecutor. They have to talk with the victim without the presence of the perpetrator. So not to go into the details, the forms are very, very good as they really give the steps and lay them out. And it's important that they're networked. The police through the protocol and the social work center. So it's also important that a risk assessment is being done. The risk assessment is being performed by both the police using the form. It's the last item on the form, so the last box is risk assessment, but the Center for Social Work is also making the risk assessment. With respect to the healthcare institution, they have that obligation, as well as the education institution, including also the prosecutor's office. So all of that is being done before the case comes to court. The proceedings are led before the misdemeanor courts, and we have a few cases that are in fact going to criminal courts. Our law on protection foresees emergency of the procedure, so detention within a few hours. The proceedings are completed without any delay. There is a person of trust used in the majority of cases, and usually in the physical form, so to say, these are people who are employed with the NGOs or shelters, but a person of trust can be anyone else from the family, a sister, brother, uncle, supporting the victim through the proceedings and monitoring the entire proceedings from the moment report is filed until the case is completed. In our court proceedings, the person of trust is not taking an active role in the proceedings, so will not testify, for instance, in court, but is constantly present with the victim, maybe to suggest, to monitor the proceedings, to be there until the end, to tell the victims what her rights are. So in that respect, we do have a person of trust. And that person definitely is involved in the entire process. Thank you, Judge. Thank you for this reflection. We know that in the practice of Montenegro, the person of trust is an instrument that led to certain results with respect to empowering the role of the victim in all the process and supporting the victim. And we also know that you have these uniform templates or forms that are being used. Someone mentioned that they are now being revised at this point of time. Someone, I think, said that during the preparation for the conference, but that tells us that there is a form of progress in that respect. Do we have anyone else? I do not see everyone's screen because there are many of us, but on your screen in the lower part, you have participants. When you click on that, you will find the option raise hand. Therefore, I will be able to see, as will be other co-moderators. Or if you like, you can also send a message in chat. But there is always an option also to start speaking. And I'm sure that the screen will show your face. We're not in a conference room, and so we cannot read body language. We can not read, the faces of people. That's very important, really. And I miss it here. Reactions are very important whenever you do something or whenever we have a discussion. I hope this is not just one in a range of conferences where we adopt guidelines. In my view, the more important thing for me is the following question. If we are to continue, so we take the document that has been developed and we do implement it in our respective states through advocacy and in other ways. A lot has been done in many states. In every state, there are things that have been completed. Of course, we have the minimum common determinant here, but we also have the specificities in respective states. We've just heard from the judge from the misdemeanor court in Montenegro that they have a person of trust. Liha mentioned that we also have this mechanism in place. But based on this document, to what extent is it possible now for NGOs as the primary advocates to initiate further activities, or maybe in cooperation with the partners to prepare themselves a proposal of a document or a plan that they would submit to the competent authorities, a platform of some sort? These are guidelines, but how can we practically translate them into an actual plan? So that might be the theme for discussion. What is realistic? So imagine we have a vaccine tomorrow and we all get vaccinated. We know what countries will get the vaccine first. Those that have more money, we know who will be vaccinated first. It's a risk factor. I mean, we will see how successful the vaccine will be, and the winter period is coming. So if there is not a pandemic, there will be another crisis happening. This one is specific because it's spreading so fast, but crisis is not something unknown to us. So my question is, how realistic it is to really put these guidelines into practice, to translate them into practical effects? So that's my question that I wanted to share with everyone. Thank you, Yasminka. Do we have anyone's reflection? In the meantime, I'd like to say that the judge who had to leave early yesterday, Judge Fatima, is unfortunately positive to coronavirus, and she informed us about this. So I'd really like to ask all the colleagues who are in contact with her to wish her well, and I hope that she has the form that I had, because I really didn't have heavy symptoms. I'm really sorry that she is not with us, because she has examples in her practice that are not characteristic of the region. She is stricter in the sanctioning, and it's very interesting what type of a sanctioning policy she presented and she is pursuing. Do we have anyone else who would like to contribute? Maybe to reflect on to what extent the guidelines are feasible, how can we implement them, how do you see our role future in this field? Okay, can I assume that you all agree with the guidelines and that you think they're implementable within your respective institutional frameworks? Maybe you can write in chat.
Ovako, evo ja ću staviti da ja jesam, samo tren.
Just a minute. This is from Selma again, the link for moderation. Would anyone else like to say something, or should we bring back the discussion to the domestic field? Yeah, every time I think somebody wants to say something and the center is sending the messages on the chat. Well, Jasminka is right. Maybe this is not the best possible platform for a dialogue, but we still can use it in order to exchange our views, to see how the process looks like from your perspective. If you have anything to say about the specific position of the victims during the pandemic crisis, Judge Jevljanovic says that the isolation somehow led to the escalation of violence, and it was very difficult in abusive relationships. It was difficult in non-abusive relationships. It's by itself difficult. So how can we strengthen our own response to the crisis? Jasminka mentioned access to healthcare services. We can see how quickly we can react there. Is it realistic to expect that we can improve something?
Meliha?
Meliha?
Ja razumijem, ali iskreno razumijem zašto se učesnici...
I understand why the participants are not taking the floor, because we really discussed all these problems earlier in different seminars, and we discussed all the problems and found the best way. It's a 2-day conference, everybody listened to it, and these are difficult topics that we talk about. And now we are asking somebody to say what we should do and how. All the participants already mentioned these things. I have a few messages here. There are messages in the chat and by email. For example, participants from Serbia, colleague Ivana Hulic, who had to go for an urgent meeting. She gave an interview after the seminars and proposed certain steps that should be taken in Serbia and the region. And she said that she supports, probably all the participants from Serbia, all the guidelines that we propose. they cannot say exactly in what way the action should be taken, but maybe through expert working groups, we can find a solution. Also in the countries where the situation maybe seems fine at first sight, but when we look at the situation on the ground and when we talk to civil society organizations, yes, many protocols have been signed and something is going on in Montenegro, Kosovo, and Albania, but it is still far from a satisfying level that we are proposing here. Let me say again that not a single institution has crisis management. There are no security managers. So how can we say that through protocols or other forms we solved these issues, considering that we don't know the basics? I mean, I don't know them either, but I learned a lot to see what kind of action should be taken during a crisis. So we have to work on trainings a lot for all employees or for a specific group of people that will work on security management, so that we can put it on the level of experts who will work on these issues, as all of us could deal with this on our existing positions. Yes, the guidelines already provide this part, and it is a novelty, but also the pandemic was a novelty to us, and we didn't provide proper response because we didn't know. So apart from trainings for judges and prosecutors on bias and stereotypes, all of us have to be trained in how to respond to crisis. We have to learn about basic steps. The clients that we work for are not informed. They don't know the basic steps: to whom, how, and where the violence should be reported, and what happens next after she reports the violence, and what will happen during the curfew. So not a single protocol or a form that existed, not a single convention or any available documents. I can talk from the perspective of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Nothing could be applied. And many other organizations, not just ours, provided the first line urgent assistance, but it was all done on an ad hoc basis. It wasn't a systemic approach, and the role of the civil society is not to put out the fire every time. It's high time we solved this as we proposed, on regulatory and operational levels. It's time for all of us to take action, and positive examples can be replicated in other countries. We can take some good practices from Kosovo and Turkey, and also Bosnia can offer some good practices that are applicable in Serbia. We discussed all this in seminars, and we have taken the notes. I think it's time for changes, and we shouldn't satisfy ourselves with signing protocols or conventions only. Let me intervene, if I may, based on the results of your project. Obviously, you have advanced a lot from the mere protocol and occasional regional events. Based on the guidelines you presented and the analysis that covered all the countries whose representatives we have here today, it all shows us that you have taken an in-depth approach which responds to the needs of different countries. We have different inherited systems that cannot be changed so quickly. So the fact is that we are not having fierce discussion, but it's Friday. It's already the second day of the conference, and I guess we are all a bit fed up with this online work. This is also maybe because the guidelines are acceptable and they can serve as the basis for further cooperation and work. This is a very free interpretation of mine, but feel free to correct me if you want. And I think that the lack of a serious discussion means that we agree to what you have already agreed upon during the online seminar. It's been a pleasure and honor for me to be here online with all of you, with whom we have strong links. We have had the opportunity to cooperate and share experiences. It's Friday. We worked hard. I wish you good health and good health to your families. Let me use this opportunity to thank the UN Women for having recognized the local capacities and strengths and for supporting the implementation of project activities and the organization of this conference. I believe that we will have the chance to take stronger action in order to change our reality, especially when it comes to the improvement of the position of violence victims. Thank you all. We can wave at one another. Thank you very much. Stay healthy and good luck.